I am here with Dr. Amy Kind, Professor of Philosophy, Claremont McKenna College. Dr. Kind, thank you so much for meeting with us and talking with us about imagination. So I'm just really curious to get us going. What is imagination?
Great. Perfect first question, perfect way to get started. I wish I had a really easy, quick definition for you, but instead I think it would be easier if I talked a little bit about ways that we use imagination, and that will ease us towards a definition. So a lot of times when people think about imagination, they think about activities that they did as kids. So they think about pretending that that their living room is made up of boats, right? And jumping from one boat to another, from sofa to sofa, and you don't want to step in the hot lava. Or maybe you're building forts and you're playing some other kind of game. So childhood pretending, it doesn't have to be in childhood, but pretending is one activity in which we see imagination playing a really big role. I think when we engage with works of fiction or movies, it doesn't have to be on a written page. That's another place where we engage our imagination. So here's one way you might know that you're imagining all sorts of things when you're reading a book. You have a very clear sense of what the character looks like, and then they make a movie from the book, and the character looks completely different from how you had imagined them, right? So engaging with fiction is another place where we see imagination playing a big role. As adults, maybe we're less likely to be jumping around and avoiding hot lava unless we're playing with our kids. But I think we do all sorts of, I don't know, maybe people still do that as adults, but we do all sorts of imaginative activities when we try to escape from endless Zoom meetings or in-person meetings, and we start imagining the vacations that we're going to be taking. Maybe we do some sort of mental planning, and also all kinds of now less fanciful ways in which we use our imaginations. I think I just mentioned mental planning, but you might be trying to figure out what sofa to buy, and you go to the furniture store and you imagine the various sofas in your living room to decide which one is going to fit, which one has the best colors to match the colors that your walls are painted, and so on. I think we do a lot of imagining about our futures. So when you're trying to make a decision about what college to attend or what class to take or what career one wants to go on to, I think that's another place in which we imagine ourselves as a philosopher, say, or as a doctor, or as a soldier, in any case, in one of these kinds of activities, and you try to figure out whether it's something that makes sense for you. And then finally, I'll also mention, and this is not meant to be complete, but a complete list, but I'll also mention that I think we use imagination a lot of times when we're interacting with other people. And so I might imagine what that expression on so-and-so's face, what they're feeling, right? And I respond how I do because of what I imagine them to be thinking based on what I'm saying, or just trying to decide what would be a nice thing to do. I might imagine how that might make someone else feel. So I think imagination is important in interpersonal relationships. Now, none of that answered your question directly about what imagination is, but I hope that we see some commonalities amongst those different activities so that we can start to get a sense of it. Now, a very minimalist definition of imagination would be something like it's a faculty of thought that enables us in a sort of rich way to mentally transcend or escape the things as they actually are, presently are, in at least some respect, right? So we imagine that the sofas are ships, right? We treat them other than they actually are, or we imagine the future. That's to imagine things as to think about things as they aren't now. So we are able to, sometimes people put it in terms of mental time travel, we're able to escape our present reality in some respect by engaging in imagination. Now, if I say much more than that, definitionally, it's going to be getting into lots of controversies that philosophers like to argue about. So I'll stick with that kind of minimalist definition, but maybe I'll say one more quick thing. Just to think about, it just might help us to home in on what we're talking about. But imagination sort of doesn't commit you to truth in the way that a lot of other mental states do. So if you have a belief, it's kind of important that you're trying to get things right. You know, you want to have true beliefs. But when we imagine, although sometimes it's important that we get things right, like if you're trying to figure out whether the sofa is going to fit in your living room, it matters whether, you know, you buy the 6 feet sofa or the 7 foot sofa. But imagination is safe in a certain sense, in that you're free, you're not blameworthy if you imagine things very different from they are. You don't, you might sometimes be aiming at truth, but you don't have to be aiming at truth. And so that's just one further element, I guess I would add to my minimal characterization of imagining.
Yeah, so you said two things for sure, that it's a
Yeah.
faculty of thought and that you can do some mental traveling, because you can imagine in the future, you can imagine the present differently, you can imagine the past. And this third thing that we might add, before I write it down, I just want to clarify with you.
Sure.
You're saying that imagination can, but need not, get us to the truth?
Yeah. So a lot of times people just think of imagination as purely fanciful, right? So you might think that we have, you know, belief on the one hand, and then we have the more fanciful imagination on the other hand. And so belief is connected with truth and imagination is not connected with truth. That, I think, goes a little too far. And that's why I emphasize that we can imagine towards actuality or towards things as they actually are, but we don't have to. So we can step away. We typically do step away from the truth. So we're not aiming to, we don't have to be aiming to get things right when we're imagining.
There's something about this way that you characterized imagination that I think would be a part of the explanation for why we keep assuming imagination is just just fiction. And
Yeah.
it has to do with your talk about pretending.
Yeah.
And that makes me think of creativity.
Sure.
And can you try to maybe explain to me what about imagination keeps this aspect of creativity and pretending, but still allows us to track the truth?
Okay. So I think I don't use the words imagination and creativity synonymously. And I think that it might be that we can be creative by accident, just get lucky and not really use our imaginations. Maybe you happen upon an invention in some way. But I do think that a lot of times the way that we engage in creative enterprises is by way of imagination. And so it's in this practice of escaping from the here and now in some respect that we're led to genuine novelty, right? And so a further way that you might want to think about it is a lot of times in imagination, we sort of loose the constraints, right? Like we unshackle ourselves. And I think it's that kind of, so we're unshackling ourselves from the truth or from the world. And so it's in doing that that you might think that we're best positioned to do something genuinely new or something genuinely creative. If you look, you can find these tests for like outside the box thinking. And what they do is they'll give you an object, the name of an object, like a brick. And they'll say, try to come up with as many different uses for the brick as possible in 30 seconds or a minute or however long they give you. And, you know, it's pretty standard to come up with various things like, oh, I can use it as a paperweight, right? Or I can, depending on how violent you are, you know, I can use it as a weapon, or I can use it to hit my brother, or I can use it as a doorstop, right? And then what you find is that when people are really thinking about the brick, I'm curious, like I should give everyone a few seconds to think about it. But when you're really starting to let go of the constraints and you're using your imagination, you can get much more creative. So you might think of grinding up the brick and using it as some kind of fairy dust, right? Or you might think of using the brick, you know, you can carve it into different shapes. And so you sort of let loose from the constraint of this brick as a single object, and you come up with a lot of different possible uses for it. And there, I think we're being both imaginative and creative. So I think imagination and creativity are tightly connected. I do think that a lot of the uses of imagination where they're really important for planning and so on are also creative uses. It's not just the pretending. So you can plan better vacations if you're more creative about the kinds of activities, you know, you might undertake, or the locales to which you might visit, and so on.
So it seems like you want us to be clear that imagination and creativity are not the same thing, but they are tightly associated. And
Yeah.
then I really should add that when we're talking about the imagination, imagination is something that could lead to the truth sometimes. So it's not just this pretend, not truth stuff.
Right.
Thanks for helping me understand that better. So, imagination could lead to fiction, it could also lead to nonfiction. Got it.
Yeah.
Is it something about the person themselves and their life experiences that allows their use of their imagination to get the truth, or is somebody's past experiences and understanding not related at all to their use of the imagination? What's the link here between what you know already and how well you can imagine, so that we have this result of what imagination could do for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that past experiences do definitely matter, because in drawing on our imagination, we're sort of calling upon an experiential base that we've built up, right? Like all your stock of experiences that you have. And so let me give you, let's talk about when we're trying to plan for our futures, or we're trying to understand one another, right? If one might find it difficult to accurately imagine the path of like what it would be like to be a philosopher, right? Like that career path, if you've had no experience whatsoever with philosophy, right? Like how can you imagine what being a philosopher would be like? Or take something like being a soldier or being a surgeon, right? I mean, there's a lot of heavy stuff involved in those kind of career choices. And so when you're thinking about them, if the kinds of past experiences that you have to draw on help you to imagine what kinds of experiences might be involved in those activities. Now, some are skeptical of our ability to engage in those kinds of imaginings productively, like skeptical of our abilities to get things right. And so you might think that the more relevant experiences that you have, the better off you'll be. I don't think it's just a question of what experiences you've had, because I do think some people are more skilled at others at drawing on their past experiences. And I like to think of imagination as a sort of process of, you pull a little from here and a little from here, and you put them together and you expand this, and stretch it, and you shrink this and stretch it. So you're not just drawing like past experience A and like clunking it together with past experience B, but you're shaping, right? You're mixing and refining in imagination. And so the experiences that you've had will give you sort of the raw materials for that. And then how good you are at putting them together and at drawing and mixing and shrinking and doing all that stuff will ensure how you can get to whatever imaginative result you're trying to get to.
So you're saying that there is a sense in which your life experiences shapes your imagination. And I want to reverse that and ask you the same question. Does one's imagination shape their future experiences?
Great. I guess I would say yes. I think imagination can shape the future as well. So lots of different ways that this can happen. But one thing I think that maybe it will be a familiar experience to people, is I think that a lot of times before we engage in an activity that we're worried about, we might mentally rehearse it and we might imagine how it will go, and that can help the experience go better. So if you're, athletes do this a lot, actually. They engage in a lot of mental imagining of what it's going to be like when they're at the starting gate, or what it's going to be like with the sounds of the crowd. And that can help them really perform better in the moment. So this kind of mental imagery usage in sports is actually a really big industry, one might almost say, working with sports psychologists, to get better at doing this kind of imagining so that you can perform better at the starting gate. But for those of us, I'll speak for myself, who's not a competitive athlete of any sort, in any sport, nonetheless, I find that when I imagine if I have to have a difficult conversation with someone, if I imagine how that conversation will go, I might decide, oh, I really shouldn't say this. I should start with this approach instead. And so my imagination is going to sort of shape how I approach the conversation. Or, when I'm imagining what vacation to take, that's going to shape which decision I make. When I imagine which career I'm going to choose, right? That's going to shape my future, and maybe in a more dramatic way than the vacation. I think we can also use imagination to help us become the kind of people that we want to be. So when we are imagining how our other people, we might decide to just sort of, in a more broad way, we might decide to respond this way more than that way. I don't mean just in the moment, but just as a general matter, like, oh, it would be better if I prefaced my comments as a general matter with this kind of opening, or it would be better if when I step into a classroom, I start this way rather than that way as a general matter. And so that is and I determine that on the basis of my imagining. So my imaginings help shape me into a person that I want to be. Those are just some examples. There's probably a zillion more, but I do think imagination can shape our future.
So our past experiences can shape our imagination, and our imagination can also shape other experiences that we have. You gave a ton of examples, and they all seem like really good outcomes. So you use the example of imagining this couch at this store in your house and thinking about whether it fits in before you do the purchase. Sounds like that's really smart. That would be beneficial. imagining yourself in that line of work before you commit to a major or a job sounds really beneficial. And all your examples sounded like they would help us. I'm wondering if using the imagination to shape our experiences would ever be a bad thing. Could you use the imagination in a way that's somehow abusive?
Hmm. Okay, so I have a few different thoughts on that. So first of all, some of these planning decisions, if you're not using your imagination well, then things can go really awry, right? If I just either because I am just bad at imagining, or because I misread your expression or something like that, and I might imagine what you're thinking, and I could be just horribly wrong. And now I don't know what choice we have there, right? I mean, we can always benefit by doing more of just asking one another, how we feel. But I can't do that every time we're having a conversation, right? Like, oh, what do you feel now? Oh, and what do you feel now, right? Like, we would never be able to get anywhere. So we're going to have to do some kind of projection in order to communicate. And so, but sometimes that has bad results because sometimes we get it wrong. We're not, even if we're good at it, we're probably not perfect at it. So that's one. I don't want to say it's, I guess I want to say it's a danger of imagination, but it's kind of a danger that we can't avoid, right? Because we have to interact with one another. Now, there's something else, though, that came to mind when you were talking about dangers of imagining. And you might, I don't know if this is where you were going with it, but one might worry that here are two different kinds of, you might think, dangerous imagining. So one is a kind of obsessive, maybe they both are, but the first one I'm thinking of is kind of obsessive imagining. So suppose you actually, I think new parents do this a lot. They're constantly imagining their kids in danger, right? Like running out into the street, or this kind of horrible event happening. And that may really get in the way of your ability to enjoy various things. And if the imaginings are intrusive, and you find it hard to stop them, it might be that those kinds of imaginings are harmful to you, and harmful to your ability to sort of make your way in the world. Now, we might think that's imagining gone wrong because it becomes sort of obsessive, like you're constantly imagining the worst. But that's, I think, one danger. Now, a different kind of obsessive imagining, and we often use a slightly different word for it, but when we talk about fantasizing. And so if there's a fair amount of philosophical discussion about, well, obviously there's a lot of philosophical discussion about ethics and morality and that kind of stuff. But then with respect to when we do someone harm, or we wrong them in some way, there's a question about whether we can do that by merely imagining, right? So if, hitting you is wrong, what about imagining hitting you? Is that wrong? Now, let's suppose that I imagine hitting you, and that makes it more likely that I'm going to hit you in the future. Well, then that would be bad. It's maybe not a problem in and of itself of the imagining, but it leads to this bad result, right? Like it desensitizes me towards violence or something. And so that would be a reason not to do it. But then there's this other question of, is it just wrong to imagine it? Like, even if it never makes me more likely to hit you, just imagining it, is that a problem? Now, I could use some other examples, but they tend to be kind of disturbing. So I'm going to just stick with the hitting, and people listening can maybe fill in more disturbing examples if they want. But you can see how we would worry that even just in imagination, there might be certain subjects that we shouldn't be thinking about, or it just seems like it's not the right way to think about other individuals. So.
Yes, and those are really great examples. So you gave a ton already. about how you can use your imagination for good, and you can even obtain truth through imagining well. And now we have this other set of examples where it seems like imagination can also be used poorly if you're wrong, but also you might be able to abuse your imagination. But let me ask you about a new kind of example and see what you think. What if there is someone who is using their imagination to reshape the way that they are visualizing their relationship with someone? Say that there's an absent parent, and so the child is imagining that they're a really good person. Their parent is a really good person, and through this imagination, the child hates their parent less or blames their parent less. And so if you use your imagination to totally make something positive up, is that neutral, or is that bad, or is that good? Or how do we understand some kind of case like that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one to think about, because I think we're going to have to tease it apart into some different dimensions, because on the one hand, it might be exactly the right coping strategy for you. In other words, it might just be what you need to do to get through the day, or you're just gonna not be able to cope with relationships and so on. So insofar as it is a good coping strategy, I don't want to say someone shouldn't try to do that. And I do think that maybe we can put it this way, when like you sort of put it in terms of just making something up. So let's put that aside for a minute, but let's just say we use our imagination to sort of recast past events in a slightly different light. So to give us a different interpretation where it's not, necessarily like just fiction. It might, but we're trying to explore a possibility, like maybe this is what was going on. That seems to me perfectly fine, right? Because who knows, maybe we misperceived things. So anyway, if it's not the purely making things up, right, but we're just imagining like, oh, maybe this is the better interpretation. Okay, I think that's good, actually. I mean, can lead maybe to better understanding. Now, what about the just making something up? Well, again, if that's the only coping strategy, maybe it's okay. But I guess, although I think it's fine for us to do all sorts of pretending and game playing and engaging with fiction and escaping, like all that kind of escapism is great. But when it comes down to sort of when we're engaged in an enterprise of just really trying to understand the world or understand how things happen, and if we're using imagination for that, it seems like maybe we should care about truth. And so just making something up probably isn't going to be, insofar as we care about, like, say, rationality, maybe that's not the best strategy. But I think reshaping past events in the sense of, well, to go back to a word I used earlier, maybe like loosening certain constraints, like you viewed it this way, maybe you unshackle those constraints and you're able to see a different possible interpretation, a new interpretation. Maybe this is why they did this stuff. Maybe there's some good there to be seen anyway. Perhaps that can be a positive use of imagination in that difficult situation.
So you turned this into a really great example, and thanks for teasing it apart. And it becomes very clear that imagination is a very powerful tool, and it could be used to bring about the truth to somebody. If you use imagination to learn about something in the world, it sounds like you can use imagination through the sports psychology that you were talking about and be more effective at your game. Okay, so if this thing is so amazing, I'm curious, could someone teach us how to better use our imagination? Since it's such a powerful tool, I'm wondering, can you teach someone to imagine better, or is imagining not one of those teachable things?
So this is exactly what my own philosophical research has been on very recently. I'm super interested in this question because I do think that imagination is a skill. And so I do think that, like other skills, it's something that people can be better or worse at, and it's something that can be taught. Now, one thing that's kind of tricky in thinking about imagination as a skill, well, a few things. So first of all, normally when we think of skills and getting better at, like, what do you do if you want to become a juggler? What do you do? Well, you start with one ball and you're throwing one ball in the air, and then you go to two balls, and you're trying to see if you can do that. And I'm not a juggler. I've seen my kids learn how to juggle, but it takes a lot of repetition and a lot of practice. And so you might wonder, first of all, how you can get that kind of practice for imagination. So that's one question. And then a related question is, when you're learning a new skill, you also get a lot of direct instruction from someone, right? So if, the juggling teacher will say, oh no, you should let the ball go a little faster, or let the ball go a little slower, or let me switch to another skill. Like you're doing piano, and the piano teacher says you should try this, fingering of the keys rather than that, or why don't you speed up that part of the piece so that you can do this part of the piece better. But the point is that you get this kind of direct instruction and correction, and you might wonder, like, well, no one can see what I'm imagining, so how are they going to be able to give me that kind of correction and instruction? So those are two of the challenges that we face when we're thinking about, like, teaching someone else to imagine, or someone's just trying to train on their own, like to become a better imaginer. So that said, I think the problems are solvable. I don't think that they're unanswerable. So first of all, I actually think we do a lot of practice at imagining as children just by, reading picture books, right? And we start with nursery rhymes, and then we read picture books, and then we read more complicated books. And I think we're stretching and exercising and practicing our imagination all through that. So that's probably how those of us who read as children, who were able to engage with books as children, I think we get a lot of imaginative practice just over that course, and likewise in pretending, right? And notice also, when we pretend, we often pretend with others. And so that's one place where we might get some feedback, right? So you say that's the hot lava, and then someone else says, oh, well, then let's make this the safe castle, right? Where everything is fine if you can just get to the safe castle. And you sort of build the imaginative scenario together, and you get some feedback on what you're imagining and what else to imagine, and so on. So those are some, in childhood, ways that we get practice, and we also get feedback. But I think that there are things that we can do as adults, besides just doing more reading and so on. And I think some of this we do naturally, and some of this we would have to sort of work more at. But I mean, you can really make it and take the effort to, when you're reading the newspaper or reading a book or talking to someone else, really to take a moment and stop and try to imagine the scenario that's being presented. Really stop and pause, and don't just skim to the next line. And that is a kind of conscious and deliberate imaginative practice. Now, the athletes, they have very it's actually fascinating, I think, to look at. They have these very detailed and explicit imagery scripts that they go through that say, for whatever sport, picture yourself, blah, blah, blah. You hear this, you then do this, you then do this. And it's a very elaborate script. And by practicing with that script, they get better at what they're doing. So I think that the evidence there suggests that with practice, there's the possibility of improvement. I was going to say one other thing, which is, so I myself am not a meditator, but people who do guided meditation tell me that that is another place where we might have a way to get imagination practice, because of the kinds of scenarios that are presented to you in the guided meditation and what you're asked to picture over the course of the meditation exercise. So that's another place where we can get practice. Now, what about the correction, right? Like where someone, like the piano teacher tells you how to move your fingers, or the juggling teacher tells you, you know, how to manipulate the various juggling balls. Well, I don't think we get that much of that for some of these kinds of imaginings, but we do in others, in other cases. So we do get feedback from other people all the time about whether we were imagining them correctly, right? Because we get their reactions to us. And so when someone says, you know, no, I wasn't angry, right? Like, why are you responding to me as if I was angry? Well, we get some feedback there. Or when someone says, I was angry, you know, like, why didn't you pick up on the fact that I was angry? Well, there again, we get some feedback. And then if it's something that you, right, think of how many hours it takes to become a good juggler or a good piano player. If you want to become a good imaginer, maybe you have to put in some time. Maybe I need to take a description. Here's a sort of silly thing. Maybe I'm not good at art, but maybe I draw something and then I describe it to you and I ask you to imagine it. And then I show you, you know, the picture, and you get some feedback by, were you able to imagine the picture that was described to you? Anyway, those are just some thoughts on the question.
So it sounds like this is really complicated, and I'm going to ask you to go a little bit deeper.
Sure.
You're saying that imagination is a faculty of thought. So imagining is a part of what you do with your thinking. And that might be the reason why it's a thing you can get better at, because it's an activity.
Yes.
You've also said that imagination is a skill, and that's a separate reason why we might justify this claim that imagination is something you can get better at because it's a skill and you can get better at skills. Is one of those like the reason why imagination is something you can teach and learn and improve at, or is it a combination? What makes imagining something you can teach and learn and improve at?
Well, I guess I think that there are some activities where it's just you're either doing them or you're not doing them. What would be a good example? I don't know, maybe I'm having trouble thinking of a good example, but maybe just like sitting, right? Like, okay, can you be better or worse at sitting? I'm not so sure. But sitting is still something that we do, right? But then there are certain activities like running, you know, can you be a better runner than someone else? Well, there usually we think about running faster, right? Or running for a longer distance or something like that. Certainly those are.
As you run, you're breathing as you run, all of those things matter all of a sudden.
Right. And so that's an activity that we can talk about doing better or worse at. So I guess I think imagining is an activity, it's a mental activity, and it's one of the mental activities that is a skill. And that's the fact that it's a skill is what makes it possible for us to get better or worse at it, and that we can train it and so on. So maybe not all activities are skills, or some of them are sort of all or nothing, like either you can do it or you can't. And imagining and many skills are come in degrees, right? They're gradable, how well we can do them.
So. Interesting. So imagination in general is teachable and learnable. That's really interesting. So does that mean, and you've made it clear that you think imagining and being creative are not synonymous. Is pretending and being creative equally as teachable and trainable and improvable, or is that another way in which imagining is somehow special?
It's a tricky question. Philosophers debate with respect to creativity. Some say creativity is the gift of the muse, right? Like, so either you have it or you don't. That's just a expression that probably it was Plato who used it. I don't even know. But the idea is, you were born with it or you're not, right? Or you were gifted it or you weren't. But I think a lot of philosophers reject that picture of creativity, and they think that we can become better at being creative. Pretending, I mean, I guess we do talk, yeah, we do talk about people being better at pretending or not, because we talk about acting, right? And so there are many people that are much better actors than others. And acting is a skill, and you can take acting classes. And I think imagining plays a really big role in acting. And so, I mean, when we're kids, we might say like, oh, this child is a better pretender than this child, but we probably don't make it's probably more what we probably mean more in that context is this child pretends much more than that child, like they're just doing it more. But when we think about acting, I mean, we have debates all the time about, is this person a better actor than that person, right? How crappy an actor is this person? So it's definitely it's definitely a place where we talk about a kind of pretending being a skill.
So earlier we said something about adults, and here's one way in which adults do use their imagination.
Absolutely.
The green screen, improv.
Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
So is there a important connection between imagination and creativity? Or is this just something we've put together as the public? But really, if we're being serious about imagining, we don't have to talk about creativity at all?
I think, I mean, I don't think we have to talk about creativity when we talk about imagination, but I do think that they often go hand in hand, because it's this, if you think about what creativity is, and I think my dog's making a cameo, or just made a cameo, one of my dogs. I think when we think about creativity, we're talking about a certain kind of novelty, right? Something that's never been seen before, or at least never been seen before to you or to you and your society. And go back to what we said about imagination, which is, or very early on, about it's enabling you to mentally transcend, right? Like how things are right now. And so it looks as if that's a way of getting us to this novelty or to this newness. So I do think that it's no surprise that we see imagination and creativity going hand in hand. I think there can be some uses of imagination which we might want to say there's nothing especially creative about them. For example, you might engage in the same imagining every night, for whatever reason, or you might just find yourself imagining, well, it's tricky about whether earworms are really imaginings or not, but you might just find yourself imagining a tune. And when you're imagining that tune, is there anything really creative about doing that? I don't know. But so there might be some imaginings that are non-creative. There might be some creative acts that didn't come from imagination. But nonetheless, I think it's natural for us to think of them as at least importantly connected.
Interesting. So here's my last question.
Okay.
Is there anything about imagination that is hands down the most important thing to remember when thinking about imagination?
Gosh, I don't know what to say. I guess I would say that when we're engaged in a sort of scholarly, academic, intellectual environment, I think imagination gets short shrift, right? Because it's all about like memorization and rationality or something like that. And so I guess I would just say that when we're talking about all different sorts of things that we care about, learning and intellect and all sorts of stuff, don't forget about imagination. It's got to be on the scene.